like, wow.
Yeah.
There's no better freeway system. There's just too many red lights. Yeah. Well, okay, wow, I'm always at a red light here. Yeah, there's one there.
That's maybe that I'm going to because I did it in high school. I'm very little. I know when my but I say it was fun. It's really all.
Everybody was like, they didn't summer. So nice. So I didn't have to go. They have no. Santa Cruz, I really couldn't write that about Santa Cruz.
I'm gonna get out of the line.
They're really expensive, no matter what you do. I don't know, we're completely unknown the price.
How are you?
Good, okay, good.
I'm a little sick, so don't come too
Okay, no,
close.
that's fine.
I just don't want to get
You, okay?
Excuse me, thank you. Are we still meeting today?
Yes,
Okay,
we are.
right
And
after.
then- Yes, and then do you have a fridge?
I do.
Okay, so then that can go in there. Unless you wanna,
Can I?
yes, you can. So it's, right, so it's. You know, right? So it's Prince technique, basically that's in Simi Valley.
What? Okay, where?
So, yeah, so.
Where?
Yeah.
In Simi.
Yeah.
Okay.
Right next to that little.
My kids are like obsessed right now with like French and Japanese everything.
Okay,
So
okay,
they
and
might
they
get a
have
kick
like
out of it.
matcha and.
Cool.
Yeah,
Thank you.
right, yeah,
Super
are we
sweet.
into that, right?
Yeah.
Don't you like that? There's another one, because my daughter's really into that too.
Nice.
But we're always out on,
I get it.
like, my daughter and I are always trying to find space to do that.
Same.
You
Same.
know, always.
Is she feeling better?
Yes.
Good, good. Finally, yeah. All right.
They have.
All right, good morning.
I'm fighting, I feel like feel like, I know I'm getting sick, so I'm standing back here, but I can feel it in my throat. So, bear with me, but I wasn't about to miss today because we have your exam on Wednesday, so, just bear with me. I'm gonna stay way back here, right? But did everyone have a good weekend? Yeah, yeah, it feels far away already, right? For some reason, today was hard to get up this morning. I'm guessing maybe that wasn't just for me by the fact that we're missing a few.
Yeah, they're coming, don't worry.
They're coming, they'll be here eventually. I got a new car yesterday. I was so excited.
Wow.
My kids were so bored.
What?
I mean, that's a no.
I got well, so I had an F-150 before, like a F-150 truck. I got the F-150 lighting. It doesn't even have an engine. It's so weird, right? They, we went to get it and they opened the front and there's no engine. So I have a trunk and the front or an engine. A front. I have a front.
So how does it work?
It's electric, completely electric. So now I have to learn that system, but I'm super excited.
Got my car, like I was shaking for 2 days.
Yeah.
And it was so, like, not even nervous. I was
Yeah.
excited. I was like.
Right? I know, we,
Giddy. It's such a fun feeling.
it is a fun feeling. We were driving, I didn't finish getting it till like 10 PM last night, forever, because we got two cars. And so I was driving home the whole time, like, I love my car. I was so excited.
You gotta rip the Band-Aid off and take a beach trip.
Oh, I know. Or put my dog in it. That's
Yeah.
the, if I let my dog get in it, it's over.
Yeah. A car Newton, you go.
I know. That's right, right? Yeah, with no gas, no gas. It's so strange.
Anywhere.
Yeah,
No.
I know. Now I have to find all the chargers and learn that system, but that's okay. I love it. It's like shiny and blue. I'm excited, right? But no stickers. All my
No.
football stickers are gone. So I'll be reordering football stickers. Anyway, I was excited, so I had to share it with somebody. So brand new, right? I had another thought. Now I'm thinking about that and you distracted me with pastries, right? It's all over. Anyway, I'll talk about that at the end, but remember, we don't have class on Wednesday because we do have our first exam. Okay, so we'll finish up with this chapter today, and then we have our first exam on Wednesday. I graded all of your first part of your papers that everybody turned in. Everybody got full points, except I think a couple of people who just gave you like one sentence. And I said I wanted a little bit more. Otherwise, some fun characters. And again, you're always welcome to change your character. If you think of somebody else, that's totally fine. You don't have to resubmit it. Just you can change it, but I would definitely do it before you submit part 2, right? Once we get to part 2, which isn't due until April. So we have a long ways to put that off. Once you submit that part, it's a lot of work to switch it. So I would just recommend, like, if you're on the fence, try and pick somebody soon so that you don't do more work than you need to. Yeah.
Let's be right. Ask it.
wasn't that big of a deal, but if I was a celebrity, is that off limits? Or, cause I don't mind the character I'm doing. but
Yeah.
I was thinking like, there's a celebrity I really wanna do, but.
Who's that out of curiosity? Okay, okay. Yeah, go for it. Yeah,
That would be a good one.
sure.
But
Honestly,
honestly, like, I'm okay with the character.
nobody's ever done a celebrity. I'm fine with it. That's fine. I mean, you have plenty of information. That would
That's
be
kinda what I was thinking.
just as interesting, if not maybe more so. So that's totally fine.
All right.
Yeah, yeah. Anything else about the papers? Part one was easy. Part two, we'll do a little bit more, but we'll talk about that later. We won't worry about that for now. We'll get back into stress, right? So we talked about trauma and what is trauma. Again, really interesting book, right? If you want to know more about this topic, I would definitely recommend it. It's kind of like the gold standard of this topic at the moment. So two main stress disorders, and then there's one that isn't formally recognized, but it's gaining a lot of popularity. Sounds like the wrong word, but a lot of traction. So we'll talk about that as well. But two different disorders related to trauma: acute stress disorder and post-traumatic stress disorder. And the two of these have the exact same criteria for everything, except how long they last and how quickly they start. So they're the exact same everything, except acute stress disorder is much shorter lasting. The way I always remember this, and it might be a little insensitive, and I'm sorry for that if it is, but it's just a cute little stress disorder, right? Like, it's so small, right? It doesn't last very long, right? So if that helps you to remember it. But with both of these, somebody has something traumatic happen to them, and then it kind of like haunts you afterward. I think that's a good word for thinking about these. It stays with you. So something traumatic happens and you experience all sorts of symptoms from it. You have flashbacks, you think about it, it interferes with your life. But the biggest difference is acute stress disorder happens within 4 weeks. So right away, like very quickly after a traumatic event, and it lasts less than a month. Versus PTSD can happen at any time, and it can last for years, if not forever, right? For some people, if they don't ever get treatment. So acute stress disorder is really common. And it might be that you diagnose someone with this, and then it lasts longer than 4 weeks and we change it to this. That happens a lot too. So let's say you get into a car accident and you're refusing to drive. You're having nightmares about the accident. It's interfering with your life. We might diagnose you with acute stress disorder if that all happens really quickly. And then let's say it persists longer than a month, we would change it to this. Okay. And I think the tricky thing with both of these is you always have to think about like, what's an expectable response, right? Like if you got into a car accident, I would say it would be normal to be afraid to get back in your car for a period of time. Okay. Or maybe for the rest of your life, when you go through that intersection or that off ramp or that time of day, it crosses your mind, right? My partner got into a car accident 14, 15 years ago in the valley. Like she was turning left and somebody went straight and plowed right through her. Right? Every time she turns left at a light, I see her go like this. Every time, right? It doesn't stop her from driving. It doesn't interfere with her life. But when we go through intersections turning left, she always like hunkers down, like she's waiting for it. I would say that's normal, right? So the key with these versus like normal is they make it where you won't do the things that are triggering for you. They have nightmares or flashbacks or anxiety about them. They interfere, right? They cause that significant distress and impairment. So if you experience something traumatic, it's normal to react. But these two are disorders that last much longer and are much more severe, like presentations of them. Anyone have people in your life with PTSD? Any comments, stories? Yeah.
My daughter does car accident, but I think this is what sets her apart. So she won't let anybody, because somebody else was driving, so she won't let anybody else drive her at all. She has to be the one. Yeah. And the only other person she'll let drive is me. And if you go over a speed bump too fast, and that's not even what the person hit. They hit a curve and then went up and hit a light pole in Beverly Hills.
Okay.
But she also or dips in the road, anything that shakes up the car too much, she flips out.
Sure.
And then also she totally had a breakdown when she saw the person walking through Walmart because the girl ended up, this girl wasn't hurt at all. The girl looked at her phone. And she could care, it's like she had no empathy. It's like she tried to say, oh, we went through the same thing. No, my daughter had to relearn how to walk all over again. We're talking about it. I mean, her leg was so smashed, you know? So I would think that would be post-traumatic stress syndrome because, or disorder, because it's not, just in that area or whatever. It can be anywhere and it can happen anytime.
Yeah, and this can range from like really mild, where it interferes on a very minimal level, only maybe related to that one area, bless you, or it could be very broad and interfere with a lot of things. So yeah, I mean, I think that's the crazy thing with these is everyone reacts so differently to stress that, you know, there's such a spectrum. There were a couple, there's another. Any other like thoughts or stories, comments, anything yet?
I think especially in California where apparently our drivers are so terrible, everyone's got
Sure.
car accidents, and I feel like it's true because LA specifically has the worst drivers that I've ever seen in my life.
Mhm.
And also at night, it's like really bad because people usually get DUIs or like, I don't know if you guys know, but like, I swear, like, and as an adult, I would see videos of like celebrities like that I saw as a kid, like Disney stars who've gotten DUIs, and you realize like Hollywood's not very pretty. It's LA itself has such a like bad driving culture that's so
Sure.
toxic, but at the same time, it's like it gives a very bad rep to every other state and every other part of the world.
Yeah, we do have a lot of accidents and
True,
traffic. Yeah, and I mean, and I use driving as an example because it's so common, right? People get into accidents sadly all the time, but this can be, you know, anything. The triggers for these can literally be anything. The standby, like the old stereotype of this was combat. This used to be called shell shock syndrome. Okay, when they first kind of coined PTSD, it was shell shock syndrome, and it was completely related to combat and soldiers, right? So people who went off to war and were in these extraordinarily like difficult circumstances would have flashbacks and nightmares and all these issues coming home. But then what we realized is it could be anything, right? So it was extended to like any kind of trauma. It could be a natural disaster, it could be an act of terrorism, it could be some kind of attack, right, that you go through. It can literally be anything that you experience as being traumatic. And with this disorder, we're talking about like big T trauma. And what we mean by that is like a large traumatic event, like one singular event typically. It could be multiple like events, but it's typically like one traumatic thing that happened to you. And then what happens is you re-experience it afterwards. I always like to describe it as it haunts you, or you have nightmares about it, flashbacks about it. You avoid anything that reminds you of that event. You're on edge, hyper vigilant, like little things set you off. Again, the stereotype is like a car backfires or a firework goes off and a veteran's on the floor, eyes wide, like sweating and panicked because it reminds them of being in combat. So you're very easily like triggered. And oftentimes people experience like anxiety or guilt or anger. Lots of like movies and characters featuring this. American Sniper is a good one. Katniss from the Hunger Games, definitely PTSD. Soma the Punisher has a character with that, right? There's a bunch of different shows and movies featuring this. And again, it's usually like a big traumatic event, but it could be in theory something smaller too. Yeah.
Yeah, right, that it would be beyond combat, yeah, right, because originally it was exclusively related to combat back in like the 60s and 70s. And then we saw that people, other experiences could lead to the same results, and kind of broaden the name and change the name to something.
A little different than this, something that this isn't formally recognized by the DSM yet. In Europe, they call this developmental trauma disorder. In our country, we're calling it CPTSD, complex post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, this isn't in the DSM, but it will be. I guarantee it'll be in the next one. It's something that has gained a lot of like discussion. This one is more like little T trauma. So more than like one big traumatic event, it's a bunch of smaller traumatic events, which is like why it's a lowercase t, right? Lots of little traumas. And it's typically thought to be something that's related to childhood trauma. So somebody who had a lot of like smaller traumatic events during childhood, maybe they didn't get their needs met, they had attachment related issues, grew up in difficult circumstances. And so that's why it's sometimes called developmental trauma as well, like they kind of interchange the names. But there's a lot of like issues that come up with this. People who have it struggle with relationships. They have what are called emotional flashbacks instead of like for the event. It can be little things can trigger you into a strong emotion and you might not understand why. So let's say somebody in your life does something or says something, it can lead to a strong emotional reaction because it triggers you back to whatever happened in childhood that you might not even consciously remember depending on the age it happened at. So you get a lot of like difficulty in relationships, struggling with emotions. There's kind of a lot of like different things here. It presents very differently, but it has some elements in common with PTSD, hence the name. I found a little video that describes it pretty well. And so I'm going to play it for you. It's like just a couple of minutes long, but it goes through some of the symptoms in I think a pretty nice way. So let me play that for you. And again, this is something that differences between the two. So again, the idea here is because it's complex, it was more than one event, typically being something that starts in like childhood. Interesting little side note, if you've heard of borderline personality disorder, which we'll talk about later in the semester, interesting, a lot of people are wrongly diagnosed with borderline personality disorder that actually have complex PTSD. They have a lot of overlap and they're very commonly misdiagnosed with each other. So just as an interesting side note, we'll get to that one in the personality disorders, but there's a lot in common with this, the emotional like reactivity, some of the flashback stuff, the destructive risky behaviors, they have a strong correlation, but this one is usually rooted more in like attachment related issues versus borderline is more of like a global personality related disorder. So just some interesting kind of dynamics emerging there, and we'll see where it goes. Yeah, did you have a?
Oh, I was just gonna. Because I think borderline is kind of attached.
Yeah, it can be very attachment based. So severity is a big one. Like, so with borderline, there tends to be a more like severe presentation of it, but they can manifest very similarly. But what we're seeing with this one is it tends to be rooted in a bunch of like smaller traumas. BPD tends to be very, very attachment related. Like when people have an attachment related loss when they're young, it can cause that, but the severity is a big one in the way that it presents, but more severe typically. Yeah. 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 Sure. So typically what would happen is they would diagnose you with something else because this isn't actually in the DSM. So what they might do is like anxiety disorder, not otherwise specified, or PTSD, not otherwise specified. So that is the tricky thing. So you could diagnose somebody with this like informally, but there isn't a diagnostic code for it yet. So what we're seeing is a lot of like PTSD, and then as a like not, every category has what's called NOS, not otherwise specified. So if you don't fit neatly into a disorder, but you clearly have anxiety or you clearly have depression, we could say depression NOS or anxiety NOS. And it's kind of like the catch-all for people who don't fit neatly. So that's how it'd be diagnosed right now, until it is actually included in the DSM. Yeah.
That is my current diagnosis, it's PTSD
Mhm.
and MS, because, but it was only, my therapist only brought up CPTSD after we went through like a trauma timeline, and it was like,
Yeah.
okay, from 0 to 18, it was just complete like instability for me.
Right.
Where it was like, they're like, yeah, there was not ever one cause that caused like my, like,
Yeah.
my issues, you know, and more recently, about like a year and a half ago, I got like diagnosed with it, where it was like look into specifically the,
Right.
like CPTSD instead of regular PTSD, and it
Yeah.
like, I was like, wow, like this makes more sense for like
Yeah.
my timeline.
Mhm.
I think it's timeline based. I don't think
a psychiatrist has enough time to like diagnose
No.
someone with it. It's something you definitely have to go through in like CBT therapy where you
Yeah.
have time to build a timeline.
Yeah,
of
because a
trauma.
psychiatrist is like 20-minute
Yeah,
quick
right.
medication
Yeah.
appointments. Yeah, versus with a therapist, yeah, you could come up with that. And again, it isn't formally recognized, but a lot of people struggle with it. I'll write them up here. There's a couple of really interesting books about this. One's like a memoir, and then there's some interesting ones as well. I've read a few, and I'll look them up during a clip later and write them up here for you if you're interested. But definitely something that's on the horizon. I think it'll be in the next DSM. With all of these, right, obviously a trauma is enough to cause a disorder, right? Like a trauma would be enough on its own, but not everybody who experiences trauma develops a disorder, right? A lot of people who have a traumatic event happen, react, they cope, and they're okay, right? Like my partner, I would say, doesn't have PTSD, at least from that, maybe from something else, but not from that. But a lot of people have that where they like experience something traumatic and they're okay. And so what we look at is maybe there are some biological and genetic factors that make some people more vulnerable than others, right? Genetics play a role. Neurotransmitters play a role. Maybe you are more sensitive biologically to the way you react to anxiety than a typical person or an average person. Your personality matters. Everybody reacts to things. Everybody has different coping strategies. Some people can handle incredible amounts of stress and they're okay. And other people, the smallest amount of stress and they crumble, right? And so that variability might play a role. Your childhood experiences, were you raised in an environment where your needs were met versus not met, right? That can also set the stage for how vulnerable you are later in life. How much social support you have? Do you have good support in your life so that you have people you can rely on to help you work through stuff? Culture, an incredible number of correlations between culture and trauma disorders. People who grew up in low socioeconomic conditions, different racial correlations and ethnic correlations are present. And then obviously the more severe the trauma, the more likely you would be to develop a disorder. So there's a lot of reasons why one person might develop a disorder and one might not. All of these are some of those thoughts. Yeah.
Conditions and are hit by stressors that are sort of that category, do they say that you are more likely to develop a stress disorder?
Yeah, right.
So-
You might be more likely to, yeah.
Because I know,
Or you could be desensitized to it and go the opposite direction.
because I know a lot of celebrities who say like they came from very broken experience, like they had very poor father or mother figures, or they were in a community that had a lot of drug abuse and they themselves suffered with their alcoholism. Like it's a very common story to hear in Hollywood, especially.
Sure.
And a lot of them say that they themselves have grown to be especially strong in these situations. So is that like an example of how these stats could be like proven wrong or just special cases you'd say?
So that'd be an example of like resilience, right? So sometimes people, when they go through really awful childhoods or events or circumstances, develop resilience and it makes them stronger. And other people, it cripples them. So that's kind of like the personality element. Like some people go one way and some people go the other, right? And it's interesting. We see both, right? We see that some people are more resilient and others are more like vulnerable, right? So it's hard to account for why, right? So they sometimes call that resiliency. Is the
And
phrase.
like type A, type B personality would say?
It could be. It's a little over, like the whole type A, type B is a little oversimplified. So, but personality, your style of personality would matter for sure. So treatments for these, they mentioned it in the little clip that I showed you. But one of the most common treatments is like cognitive behavioral therapy, right? So talking through and working through these things. You could do flooding as well. Face the thing that caused you trauma, right? So face it and try and work through it. And one of the ways that we specifically tend to treat PTSD, CPTSD, and ASD, all these trauma disorders. So we use EMDR for CPTSD, ASD, and PTSD. We can have like a letter salad, right? But we use a technique called EMDR, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. And I will be like, I'll be honest and maybe a little vulnerable with you. I've done this a couple of times. And I had a very like different notion of what it was before doing it. It's a little bit like mystical in a way, right? The idea behind this is you activate your eye movement or bilateral activation in the brain while thinking about a traumatic event. And something about that is thought to like unstick the event in your brain. The current thought is that it's almost undigested and unprocessed. And so by activating your brain in a specific way while thinking about a trauma, it's thought to allow it to be digested and processed so that your brain can kind of move through it and let it go. It can be a quick process for some, or it can be a very long process depending on the trauma. But the essence of this is it can be done with like a light. So there's a light bar and you look at a light that goes back and forth and you follow it while thinking about a trauma. It can also be done with little tappers. You put them in your hands and they buzz in an alternating fashion. It can be done in a self way where you tap in an alternating fashion as well. A lot of different ways of doing this, but you think about the traumatic event while flooding, your mind with this and activating your brain in a specific way. And something about the combination of doing that is thought to help you digest the trauma, work through it, and move through it. You identify like a target, and then you come up with a thought, and then you try and change that thought, that negative thought about yourself, you're going through EMDR. Has anyone else done this or known people who have done it? Any like comments or stories or anything? Not it. The only one? But it's a really interesting process. It was developed on accident by a woman named Francine Shapiro. She was walking through a park and thinking about like her hard day, and she noticed that something about being outside and the trees passing around her eyes on the side of her face caused her to feel better. And so they kind of jumped into an investigation of it, and they thought it was the saccadic eye movement, right? The back and forth eye movement that she was experiencing while thinking about a trauma helps you to, digest it in some different way. So a very popular treatment for PTSD and CPTSD. Yeah, it's gained a lot of popularity over the last like 5 to 10 years. Very common technique. Before we move to the other side of the chapter, any other like questions or anything else about PTSD, ASD, CPTSD? Could throw one more letter, EMDR. So many letters, like abbreviations, right? Well, the other side of this chapter, which is also very connected to trauma and stress, are the dissociative disorders. Relatively uncommon, very interesting disorders. This includes stuff like dissociative amnesia, dissociative identity disorder, or DID, depersonalization, derealization. Basically, with these, you have changes in identity, loss of memory, right? There's kind of like elements where you dissociate or separate from yourself. Now, it can be fully, like creating another personality, or it can be partially where you have like forgetting for events that happen that are typically traumatic. It's very related to trauma. And there's a few different ones in this category. Let's start with dissociative amnesia. Dissociative amnesia is when you forget like an event or a period of time in your life without a physical cause. So if you've ever seen a movie of like The Vow or 50 First Dates or like one of those movies where somebody hits their head and they forget, that's called retrograde amnesia. That's not this. Okay, so when somebody has memory loss because of a brain injury, that's called retrograde amnesia. When you have memory loss without any kind of physical trauma, it's an emotional trauma. It's called dissociative amnesia. And it can manifest in 5 different ways. And I won't ask you the difference between the first 4 because they're kind of confusing, but I might ask you to list these 5. This would be like a perfect short answer question on your exam. What are the 5 types of dissociative amnesia? So localized, selective, generalized, continuous, and dissociative fugue. With localized, with this one, it begins with something that happened. So for example, when 9/11 happened, a lot of people said that were in the towers, right, said that they remembered the beginning, but they couldn't remember what happened afterward, right? And that's very common with a traumatic event. It's like you can't remember what happened after it started. That's localized. Selective is when you remember bits and pieces. Like I remember getting out of the building, but I don't remember what happened next. Like you can remember bits and pieces. It's the most common by far. The next 2 are really rare. Generalized is when you can't remember anything before the trauma. Really rare. This is like Jason Bourne kind of stuff, like Bourne identity, right? You don't remember anything before a traumatic event. And then continuous is when you can't remember anything after the event. And so again, I won't ask you the difference between them because they're kind of blurry. But with all of them, you're forgetting because of an emotional trauma, not a physical one. Now, the one that is a little bit different and that I might ask you about separately, dissociative fugue. Fugue is Latin for flight. And with this disorder, what happens is people have a traumatic event happen to them, and then they literally take off and leave. They flee, right? So not necessarily on a plane like a traditional flight, but they flee, they run away. And they start a brand new identity somewhere else with no memory of who they were before. Really rare, but it pops up in the news every now and then. And I found a video of it, like of a news story of it about 10 years ago that I'll play for you. But the idea here, somebody has something traumatic and they literally take off and leave. And then they often forget who they are. It's like while they're on their journey away, they almost go into like a fog and they can't remember who they are. They might pick up a new name or not know what their name is. People tend to be discovered with this pretty quickly now. In the past, people would like start new lives and like go somewhere else and not remember. And it tends to slowly come back, but it can take a little while. So let me share the news story with you and then we could talk about it more. But dissociative fugue or dissociative fugue is the name for this. And again, I found a example in them. I'm not sure why I'm here, like, and they go somewhere to try and get help, oftentimes to like a news like agency or something like that, where they can like broadcast and get, you know, see if anyone recognizes them. Luckily, he was recognized. But it's really interesting that people tend to have this like recurrently, like somebody who's had an episode of it once is likely to have it happen again. And there was a really dramatic one like 15 years ago. It was a young woman who was about to get married and something about like the stress of like the situation. She took off, went 3 states over, changed her name, started dating somebody else, right? Like it like led to their like wedding being called off, like scandalous, right? You don't have any memory for the life before, and it slowly comes back. The people are in a fog for a period of time. And they oftentimes go far from home, hence the name, the flight element. They leave and go somewhere else. Pretty rare, but a little different than the other types of amnesia. A little more common, and I'm sure some of you have heard of these too. People can have what's called depersonalization or derealization. There's a disorder that combines them called depersonalization, derealization disorder. But with these, people have something where like everything feels unreal. That's a very common element with the dissociative disorders. When you have depersonalization, it feels like you aren't connected to your body, like you're not connected to your person, hence the name. So like you might not feel like your hands are your own or your body is your own. You feel disconnected, almost like you're watching yourself from a distance. And derealization is when your surroundings feel unreal. It might feel like you're not connected to reality in the sense that like you almost have tunnel vision or things seem really blurry or unreal or confusing around you. With both of these, the world feels far away or your body feels far away. And sometimes people will say it almost feels like they're floating outside of themselves, like they're watching themselves from above, right? With like depersonalization. And then derealization can almost feel like a tunnel or everything's blurry or foggy. Very, very common with trauma. When people have extreme stress or trauma, sometimes they depersonalize or derealize, they separate themselves from the world or their body as a coping mechanism of sorts, right? You're doing it to get some distance, but you don't always do it on purpose. And when you do it accidentally, it might be hard to reverse it. So a lot of things like trying to ground yourself in the moment, a lot of like mindfulness stuff, like feel your feet on the floor, focus on your breathing, like touch something and like ground yourself there, right? To kind of bring yourself back to the moment. But these are common things with dissociative disorders, everything kind of feeling unreal. Yeah.
Not sure which one it was, but I do remember they mentioned one of the two.
Sure.
But
Is it, you said it's related to dissociative disorder?
Yeah, it's in this group. Mhm.
Know what person has that kind of disorder, but you have moments like where he gets like that.
Yeah.
To the point where you said like grounding, like I remember I was at the beach and sat down on a rock and I asked what if he was okay, he was perfectly fine at first, and then all of a sudden he's like, I just need a minute to like sit here, gather what I'm feeling,
Yeah.
and I feel kind of like separated, and I guess, I don't know, because I was confused because I didn't know that, since I know that it is related to those disorders, but
Yeah.
I wasn't sure if there was like any other factors relating to other disorders that should cause that, besides being a dissociative disorder.
Yeah, so it's within the group of dissociative disorders, right? And so not feeling like things are real or feeling far away from yourself, disconnected, would be depersonalization, derealization. And we all have it a little bit, like especially when we're sleepy, like in that state just before sleep or just when we wake up, you might have these feelings. That's really normal. Like dream like state almost, right? But when you have it in the middle of the day, when you're wide awake and like functioning, it'd be like right now, it's like, it would be almost like you're sitting there, but you don't feel present. Like you feel far away is kind of the way that people describe it. Or like you don't feel like you're actually there. You feel like you're watching yourself from a distance. And so sitting down and grounding yourself is one way that people try and bring themselves back to reality.
Track themselves
Yeah.
back to their
Right.
center.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's almost like you're trying to pull yourself back, right? And that's one way that people do it of like, okay, I'm gonna close my eyes and I'm gonna focus on what are two things that I can hear? What are two things I can see? What are two things I can feel like right now in this moment? That's one way to bring yourself back to the moment. It's called grounding. It's a mindfulness technique.
Is there a difference between the two?
Grounding is a form of mindfulness.
Oh,
So
okay.
mindfulness is just anything that grounds you in the present. And that could be one way of doing it.
Okay,
Good. But that sounds a lot like this, right?
yeah,
It's a really common feeling, but when it happens all the time and it interferes with your life, that's when it would become, a disorder. Probably the one you've all know of much more than any of the others is dissociative identity disorder. Anyone know what this used to be called? A couple of names that's gone by. Yeah. Yeah, multiple personality disorder. There's one more, split personality disorder. So this is the technical name, dissociative identity disorder. And the reason they changed it is because rather than having a distinct personality, you have disassociated fragments of your identity, right? So they're not fully developed most of the time, which is why the name was changed. Very commonly confused with schizophrenia. Okay, so schizophrenia and dissociative identity disorder are totally different things. Schizophrenia, people have one personality, but they tend to hear things or see things that aren't there. They have odd perceptions. They're not in contact with reality because of the perceptions they have. With dissociative identity disorder, you have two or more like fragments of personality or personalities that take over routinely. Okay, so they're different, but the media loves to combine them, like Fight Club combines them. A lot of movies like to combine them to make it more dramatic, but they tend to be very different and distinct disorders. They're not the same. So with this disorder, typically related to trauma, people create sub-personalities that can routinely take over their being. And depending on the relationship between the personalities, that dictates how tricky this is to deal with. So it can take three different forms. If they're mutually amnesic, that means none of them know about each other. This is by far the hardest to work with. So personality A doesn't know about B, and B doesn't know about C, and C doesn't know about F. They don't know about each other. So they don't share memories. They're not able to switch personalities consciously. It's very, very challenging to work with in therapy. Mutually cognizant is the easiest. They all know about each other. They all share like memory. You can switch on command, right? And so very easy to work with because they all share memory. And then the most common is the last one-way amnesic. This is when there's one dominant, and the dominant knows about all the sub-personalities, but the sub-personalities don't know about each other. Okay, so when they're the dominant person, they can like have all that memory, but when they're the sub-personalities, they don't know about each other at all. Right? Really the most common. So most difficult, easiest, most common. But with this disorder, people typically experience a traumatic event, and then they can't cope with it, so they create other personalities to compensate or cope with it for them. And it can be like a big T trauma or lots of little traumas. But it is something that does happen. It's pretty rare, but it tends to be relatively dramatic. Lots of movies featuring this. Probably one of my favorite TV shows of all time. If any of you ever saw Bates Motel, like Norman Bates, they portrayed him as having dissociative identity disorder. And like his mother was like a version of one of his personalities. Really cool take on it. Not the most accurate always, but a really fun take on it. But a lot of movies featuring and TV shows featuring this. Yeah.
Are there any medications? This disorder?
Yeah, I mean, people can go on medication for it, but typically no. You have to work through the traumas and actually go through each personality and render them worthless to get rid of them in a way. It's called, and I'll come back to this in a minute, but it's called fusion. So you literally go through each personality until they're no longer needed, and then it goes away. Really cool take on this in a movie. Oh my gosh, I just forgot the name of it. Oh, Identity. So kind of an older movie, maybe like 15, 20 years old, and something like that. John Cusack's the main guy in it. I don't want to ruin it for you if you watch it, but this movie is all about fusion. And a really cool take on dissociative identity disorder. Just as a suggestion, if you want a fun movie. I gave you a book, that's a fun movie to watch. Yeah.
Like thoughts, it was like, you know, this really famous not judging, no, like I see his face on his name, like he's plays Will, he like killed his wife, but he doesn't realize he killed him, he's on his hunt to see, oh, what's it called? Not Jason Will. It's a really famous guy, I'm blanking on his name. Who's in the movie Jack Black? Or Joe Black, it was called.
Yeah. Oh,
It's really popular celebrity.
Brad Pitt.
Yes,
Yeah.
thank you.
Yeah.
Brad Pitt was in a movie like, his name was Will, was like not chasing Will, like I'm forgetting, but basically
Yeah.
he killed his wife and then he's now on a search to figure out who killed his wife, but he's going through episodes and every day he wakes up and he finds the same clues and he's figuring out a murder mystery. At the end of the day, it was him who killed his wife.
Oh, okay.
What would you call that if he's every day you're waking up and you're trying to figure out, but you don't want to remember that it was you and you can't accept it, so you create a new narrative? What would that be?
Yeah, I mean, it could just be a form of denial, like extreme repression, where you repress and push down as a defense mechanism. I haven't seen it, so if you think of the name of it, you have to
I
tell me,
will,
but,
I'm sorry.
no, it's okay.
Very,
it's
very,
early Monday morning, it's
it's
forgivable.
also very relevant to psychology, so
Yeah.
I'll tell you the name.
Okay, yeah.
So.
Yeah.
I'll be honest, I was very skeptical.
Sure. Yeah,
And.
that's such a common feeling about it. It seems like
Yeah.
they're making it up, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And, me and my room used to do this thing where if you don't let people know, they can say something to see things.
Sure.
And, every night before I went to bed, this one also would come out and we would sleep in the fridge, and we would sleep in the shots. And he went to bed, that's that whole time, and, in the middle of the night, I woke him up.
Yeah.
You would never, just in the middle of the night, into that.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Real. And I love that you shared that because it's such a common way that, like, such a common feeling. It feels like somebody is acting, like they're making it up, right? And the alters or subs can be drastically different. They can be different genders or sexes. They can be different ages, different accents. They're typically very incomplete though, right? Which is why they're not like a full personality. It's a fragmented, disassociated identity, which is again, why they changed the name. But it's enough that you can tell them apart usually pretty easily. Like you're saying, and that response of like, oh, it's not real is such a common like criticism. And depending on the relationship that they have, you know, this person can be aware of it or not. Which only adds another layer of complexity, right? Yeah, yeah. 7. Oh, okay, I've definitely seen 7.
The seven is a 1995.
Yeah, yeah, that's a great
No,
movie. What's in the box?
Is it not that one? No.
Yeah, I didn't-
know it's like the word is like chasing Goodwill or something. It's like, I know the name, but I'll find it.
Every time you say that, I want to say Good Will Hunting, but that does not,
Yes,
no, but that's Matt Damon, and he has borderline personality, yeah.
so it's not.
No, but keep thinking about it, but yeah, Seven's a great movie,
Okay.
so is Good Will Hunting, very different movies though, right?
I guess I'm bad.
You're laughing, right? Yeah. I'm like, Seven is a like serial killer, like
No,
what's in the
not
box
Seven.
movie.
Sorry.
Yeah, no, you're okay, yeah.
I just, question, I mean, I've always been interested in this. sort of
Sure.
in General, because it does have a more streaming nature, I know it's
Yeah.
like widely discussed, I guess my question is, in a, like, therapy or even in a clinical setting, how do you tell the difference between somebody who, you know, is maybe acting as maybe
Yeah.
genuinely does have this sort of like, what are the key markers, like, it's like.
Yeah.
it's that, like,
And it can be very difficult to tell, and that's also part of this movie too, it's like a trial of trying to decide if he's faking it or not. So typically when people switch, they have, and it's genuine and or authentic, and there's a scene of it in here that's a great example. They have different handwriting and different styles of relating, different mannerisms, different accents, sometimes kind of like you were describing. And so it's consistency, right? Oftentimes, and people have tried to fake this to get out of, like murder charges or like criminal charges of like, oh, my other personality committed the murder, right? And so it's a very rigorous, like looking for inconsistencies, but people have definitely tried to fake it. Like that's definitely a thing.
It's like, on the DSM, is it, what are like the symptoms for that? And it has to hit, like, really, like-
Yeah, so for this one, I have a list of them. It's actually really informal, right? So for this one, you have to have 2 or more distinct identities that are present, they're enduring, which means they keep coming up. You have a discontinuity of self, so you have a lot of like loss of memory, changes of consciousness, and then you have amnesia, so you have defined gaps of memory. And it has to last for at least 6 months. 2 or more identities, the most common is 3. But often people have to have at least 2. Then the highest documented number was 115 or something like that. Usually it's like 3 or 4 is the most common. 3 is the most common number by a mile. Yeah.
Like specifically like the mutually amnesic, it's like.
Yeah. Yeah.
Scans, like,
Yes. So that's one thing that has been done now. That's a very like uncommon thing to do because those procedures are expensive. But like an fMRI where it's
Yeah.
looking at how you respond to stimuli, people will show different brain wave patterns between personalities, which is wild, right? That's so crazy. Yeah.
If you don't mind going back to the, one about amnesia,
This
so,
one?
yes, yeah, so if somebody was, for example, kidnapped,
Yeah.
that could be something that could cause or
Mm-hmm.
run into that. As
Sure.
I asked, only because I was, and I don't remember.
Yeah.
I mean, I have bits and pieces.
So that'd be selective.
Okay,
Right.
and I have bits and pieces, and sometimes it's more like texture or smell or sound or
Mhm.
something, it's very odd. But yeah, so,
And do you see how much overlap there is within this group, right? Like, and you see that
Yeah.
constantly. So it could be PTSD, right? Because very common that sounds, smells might trigger you,
exactly.
right? Bring up that memory. It could be also a little bit of selective amnesia where you remember bits and pieces. With PTSD, oftentimes people don't remember the whole event either.
Okay,
And it might be part of the healing to recall and go through all the painful bits and memories. That's the thought, is you can't get over these things until you fully go through it. And a lot of people don't want to do that, right?
Yeah. that's very difficult.
Yeah.
I've been working on this like my whole life,
Yeah.
it feels like, and it's a never ending battle,
Right.
and yeah.
And everybody's different, right? So, my partner has PTSD from like an attack when she was younger. When she was in high school, she was like brutally physically attacked, right? And so she has so many little triggers with it. We'll never go to therapy to work through it. And I'm like the kind of like, well, I believe in therapy. Like I was trained to be a therapist. I like going to therapy to work through things because I want them gone. I don't want that power over me, right? And so for her, she'll never go through every little detail because she doesn't want to face it. Versus like, I'm willing to do that because I know that'll get me through it and make it go away. So everybody's so different, but you have to go through and like process the most minute details in order for it to be gone.
And that's, so I want to do that, but it's almost like sometimes I feel like I make 10 steps, you know,
Yeah.
and then I
Uh-huh.
make 5 backwards.
Yeah.
And so on and so on, but,
Yeah.
and I thought about like different types of therapy, that
Yeah.
maybe just talk therapy wouldn't, you know, maybe I need to
EMDR.
talk. You know what I'm saying, I need to do something else to finish going through all of it, because it's hard to carry stuff like that. I
Yeah.
don't want it,
It
It's
leads
not
to
fun.
physical stuff and emotional stuff, and
Yeah.
so. As hard as it is to face it, if you get it processed and you go through all of it, it tends to go away. When we don't do that, hold on to it. They like make it for the rest of your life,
Yeah.
and it can cause all sorts of problems,
other problems.
Yeah.
Yeah.
physical and emotional.
So I have a story. I think I have time for it. I've only seen this in person once. And I didn't know it at the time. And so it was so memorable. I'll never forget this, right? So when I was training to be a therapist in college, in my master's program, the first semester that we had clients, my very first client that I ever had dissociative identity disorder and didn't know it. And I didn't know it. And it was wild. And so I met with this young woman, and she was a college student. I was a college student, right? She was young, like maybe 18, 19, 20. And she came in for depression. Okay, so I'd met with this person for like 5 weeks, very like mousy, timid, quiet, depressed. Okay, I diagnosed her with depression. It felt very clear and straightforward to me. She was struggling with making friends. She was struggling with being away from her family. She was having a hard time and she was depressed. So I met with her for like 6 weeks, diagnosed her with depression. Everything was normal, like typical kind of unfolding the way you would expect. And then on the 7th week, she came in, or 6th or 7th week, she came in and was so wildly different. Like she was like talking a million miles a minute. She was presenting very differently. She was talking about people she had never mentioned before, like very up and agitated. So we haven't talked about it yet, but in my mind, I was like, okay, she has bipolar disorder. I'm seeing a manic episode for the first time. And that happens, right? You meet with someone for a while and they've been depressed, and then maybe a manic episode comes up. So I talked to my supervisor, as you do when you're a trainee, and we agreed that like, okay, it was a manic episode. Let's change her diagnosis to bipolar. And I moved on. I didn't think too much of it. But then she comes the following week. So the week after she was really agitated and off. And she comes in, and this is where it got weird, right? Or like inconsistent and fascinating. She comes in and she was back to like timid and quiet and depressed again. And I was like, okay, we've cycled back to depression. And the first thing she says to me, she's like, I'm really sorry that I didn't come last week. And I was like, oh, no, like, you were here, like, but I'm glad you brought it up. I wanted to talk to you about last week. It was a little different. And, I like, wanted to talk to her about like the episode that I thought she had. And she's just like, no, like, I didn't come because we could put it in my calendar. It's not like me to not show up. Honestly, I don't remember where I was, and I'm really worried about it. I'm like, well, you were here, and I pulled out my notes, like I had my notes, and I was like, we talked about this person and this person and this person. And she's like, with all due respect, like, you have me confused with somebody. Like, I don't know those people. That wasn't me. And I wanted to be like, well, like, I'm the one on this side of the equation here. Like, I know that I'm not wrong, right? Like, and I'm like, no, you talked about this and this and this. She's like, no, that's not me. And like, we went back and forth and back and forth. And like, my gut was telling me that this was like, really like, don't move on from this. This is important. And so I went and got my supervisor, and we record every single session when you're a trainee. You record it, you have to watch it with your supervisor and go through it. But we recorded it, and I was like, do you mind? Because we couldn't move forward. I was like, do you mind? I have the video from last week. Like, let's settle this. Let's show that you were here. I know you were here, right? And she's like, fine, play it. Like, and so my supervisor, myself, and this person sat down, we put in the video. She was there, right? And she just starts sobbing. She's like, that's me. But what am I wearing? Who am I talking to? I don't remember that at all. It was like one of the wildest psychological moments I've ever been part of. It was like out of a movie, right? And it turned out that she had been having these episodes where she was blanking out or having blackouts and couldn't remember stuff that was happening. And I experienced one of them with her. sadly, I had to refer her out because I wasn't qualified to help her. I mean, this was like literally my first client ever, right? And I always wonder what happened to her, like always, but it was the only time I've ever seen this in person. And it was the trauma of like being at school and the stress of being at school that caused her to switch. Really wild. It was the only time I've ever actually physically seen this. Yeah. Yeah, she didn't even know. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it can snowball that way, right? Where like people start to then make more personalities to cope with the changes that they're going through. So luckily, at least we caught it early for her. But yeah, that can definitely happen. Yeah. Yeah, that she had never mentioned to me before. Yeah.
Is that like? That's scary. Or like a better word.
I don't know, I've wondered for years, right, I've wondered for a long time, I think what it was is she created a very like extroverted, outgoing personality. That was the polar opposite of her like typical personality, and so in that personality, she like made friends and was social. That I'm not sure she made friends with and was social with normally. But how confusing for those people too, right, like I mean, when you think about how many people that might have touched. Right, and I've sadly have no idea whatever happened to her, I tried so hard to find out. Because it ate at me, but I wasn't able to. I look for her around campus, like, I'm like, not that you're allowed to like, say anything, but I was like, oh my gosh, I need to know, and to this day, I just don't. But that's so typical with this, like something traumatic leads to you developing another personality to compensate. Freud would say it's like repression, it's an extreme repression, you repress your personality and come up with a new one. And so what we typically do with this, hypnotherapy sometimes, but this is the main like approach. And another great short answer question, what are the 3 goals with DID? You have to help somebody recognize the nature of the disorder. That's goal 1. So what do you have? What's going on? Let's educate you. Now, if the personalities don't know about each other and they're mutually amnesic, you have to wait for each personality to emerge and educate each personality. And that can take a very long time, depending on like how long it takes for them to come up. You try and recover gaps in memory. So a lot of journaling is very common. Like, let's, find ways so you don't have these big gaps. And then as I was mentioning earlier from your question, you have to do what's called fusion. You go through and look at the purpose of each personality, and you have to try and eliminate them. And again, this movie, really interesting take on this. It's like a horror movie, but interesting take of fusion, of trying to like systematically eliminate each one of the personalities until they're no longer relevant. And that can take a very long time if they're not aware of each other, if they don't share memory. So there are obviously other ones, but those are like the big disorders within this category, all of them in this chapter related to stress and trauma. So even though we all experience stress and trauma differently, some people go to the extreme and develop disorders with it that might require, some kind of treatment. Any other comments, stories, thoughts, questions, anything from any of the other things in this chapter?
Actually, just going back to the story you brought up. I don't know if this is, because everyone has a different experience when they have that disorder. So for that, like for the example that you brought up, maybe for her or maybe for anybody else, when that happens, like let's say she said that, oh, I had it in my calendar, I didn't go to therapy. That kind of made me, I'm stuck on that.
Me
Like,
too.
is it their personality only thinking that way, or what would happen if, like, let's say that personality in that moment was taking over whenever she walked out of therapy? Does that mean that overcame her whole body to the point, like,
Yeah.
let's say she didn't even actually physically show up to therapy? Like, would that be possible? Like, would that will happen, or do you think she still was kind of there at her center, like her main personality was there, so because she clearly remembered to go to therapy?
That's what drives me like bananas in my head, right? She came to therapy and acted like she knew me, but I had never met that person, if that makes sense.
Yeah, exactly, because that's why I'm stuck. Like,
Me too. Me too.
I'm curious about that. Like, how does
Right.
someone like go from like they have a routine
Yeah,
and they go, but they don't remember the routine, but they had it in their calendar, but they went anyway.
yes. And that was like my thing that I think if anything has like bothered me about the whole thing, is that she came to therapy despite not remembering me, not knowing me, acted like she was comfortable, like there was, like, you know, it wasn't like it was her first session.
Yeah.
You know, like she interacted with me like she knew me, but like had no memory for it later. And so it might be that that was like, that the sub-personality had no memory, but the dominant does, or vice versa. So confusing, right?
So
It
like,
can
I
get really
think that it was probably muscle memory of
Maybe.
me,
Mhm.
but I was just like, whoa, like, how
Yes.
does she not remember that part at least?
That's the piece
She
that-
even came with the other personality.
Yeah.
That's why.
That's the piece that I can't, like, I'm not sure either, that's. the-
Wow.
Yeah,
So, for example, I saw a news story once when someone said, oh, I'm actually a child, like this grown adult man was like, I'm actually a baby, I'm not an adult, I need to take care of me. Could that possibly be like somebody creating a new personality where they haven't really fully matured because no one took care of them when they're younger and they don't want to remember abuse?
it could be, or it could be like a regression, another, so repression is when you push things down. Regression is when you go back to a younger age. And sometimes people will do that, you know, under stress, they'll go back to like a very childlike state where they need to be cared for. So it could be either, or it could be like something more extreme, it could be a lot of things, yeah.
There is a content creator on YouTube, who has a junior college associate,
Uh-huh,
and, she has DID, and her whole channel is about educating everybody on it. And she has like a whole playlist over time, I haven't watched it in a hot minute, 'cause
Mhm.
I love on her. But at one point, she had like a whole playlist that was like meet my alters, and there was the protector that was like a big beefy guy,
okay,
and, they all had like, some of them weren't human.
yeah, that can happen too.
And she tried to like kind of draw each person or like each personality. And
Yeah.
it's kind of cool, like to see the different ways that each alter drew themselves. Because it's like a whole different handwriting and
Yeah.
a whole different
Style.
way of art. And there was also littles as well that would come out like when something very positive or something very, you know, like exciting happened, you know, the littles would present themselves, and it was kind of cool to see the difference in it.
Yeah.
Versus, you know, and then the protector took me back over, okay, you need to give me a,
Mhm.
we're kind of not in a situation where you can, you know, be present.
Yeah,
Give me a sec, let me, you know,
isn't
let
that
me get us
wild?
into a safe place so that you can be excited about what you're doing.
Isn't that crazy? It's so wild. The whole thing is wild, right? And it feels fake. It always feels fake, I think, but it can be very genuine for people. So, in my last few minutes, I know I like to talk, but I want to know about this, say a couple of things if you have any questions. So Wednesday, today, we have our first exam, okay, and like on Canvas, I know people have different classes, you can look for the same style and format, but on Wednesday, the exam will open at 12 p.m. and they close at 11:59 p.m. So you can take it any time during the day, but you have this time free. Okay, so I'm giving you this class time to take it, but like I said before, if you'd rather sleep in or do something else, that's totally fine. Enjoy that opportunity. Just don't forget to take it before it closes. Once it closes, it is closed. And you can't take it unless you've reached out to me before the deadline because you have like an emergency. If something comes up, then you reach out to me before the deadline. I'm happy to work with you. But if you email me at like 12:02 a.m. and you're like, I missed it, it'll be too late. It'll feel horrible for you, but it'll be too late. So just please, in the back of your mind, if you have an emergency or something happens, please reach out to me before the deadline and I'm having to work with you, okay? So we don't have class because you're taking this online. The study guide is on Canvas. The study guide gives you everything you need to know. If it's on there, it'll be on the test. If it's not on there, it won't be. I believe it said you have 75 minutes to take the exam, right? It's mainly multiple choice, true, false, and then short answer questions. The short answer questions will be like, what are the 3 steps for treating DID? What are the 5 different types of dissociative amnesia? There'll never be an essay. It's almost always like a list. But what are the 5 Ds of abnormality? I just gave you 3 of them, right? And you can see them on the study guide. Never, ever will trick you. I want you all to do well. So as long as you study and know everything on the study guide, you should be in great shape. You can use the study guide on the exam. If it were me and I'm like that meticulous, like obnoxiously, like I want 100% on everything kind of student, I would do the study guide and have it in front of me. That way you could reference it. If you're like, I don't know where this term is, you're not searching for it. Because if you're trying to search for every answer, you will run out of time.
It's basically like a minute, a little more than a minute per question. It's plenty of time. People typically finish in like 57, 58 minutes on average. And you have 75 to take it. So what'll happen is after you take it, you'll get a score right away, except for the short answer. I have to go in and grade those. So I'll be grading them throughout the day. But you'll see your score right away on everything but the short answer. And then I'll grade those throughout the day and we'll see that. Are there any questions about the exam? I know exams cause people anxiety, but it's open note, open book. It should be fine. Yeah. I think there are 67 questions, I think, altogether. It's mainly multiple choice and true false. The book is a handful of those short answer that are working. Yeah.
So for test, cause like last semester we did the proctor thing, do we have to download that for this?
No, so you just go onto Canvas and you can take it. Like there's no proctoring or proof. I'm assuming it's you. I'm giving you the benefit of the doubt. Some people do that. I have chosen not to, but for better or worse, I've chosen not to. So yeah, you just go into Canvas and log in and then you can take the exam. Again, no trick questions. Take a deep breath before you take it. You can skip questions and come back to them if you don't know the answer. I think you'll all be fine. Typically, people do really well on the exams because they're open note, open book, and I haven't made them harder, right? I haven't made them any harder than the one I would have given you had you taken it in here with me. Okay, so I hope you all do beautifully on it. When you come back, when I see you on Monday, we're starting chapter 8. So we're going out of order. It says it on the syllabus, but it's very connected to this. We're looking at how stress and trauma affect the body. Okay, so kind of going out of order, but I think it makes more sense that way. Anything else about the exam? I'll miss you on Wednesday. I'll think about you. I hope you all do really well on the test. If you think of a question before the exam, email me. If something comes up, please reach out before the deadline. I'm here and I'll work with you on that. Otherwise, good luck. And I will see you all. I'll see you all in a week. See you all next week on Monday. Thank you. Yeah.
5, 6.
Tell me when. Oh, the whole network was down. I wasn't able to print
Oh,
it.
gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay.
This one?
Have you looked at
Bye, take care. Okay.
Be like, oh, I remember this.
Yeah.
To this day.
Okay. Probably more like the idea, because like with schizophrenia, schizotypal, those like kind of things, it's tricky because it could be like a hallucination, but the fact that they were like in his mind and different personalities makes me think it's more that. And sometimes they're more developed than others. Like for some people, it will take over and it's almost like distinct personality. For others, they're just kind of there. And so it can present a few different ways. It's probably kind of along those lines.
Except the thing is I never saw it.
Yeah.
It's always like an awareness.
Yeah. Well, it's so interesting, but it could be like a delusion or like a false belief. So it could be either, probably not like schizotypal, that's more like kind of a low grade, like across everything, but it could be kind of schizophrenia like.
Because that's the thing, I remember.
Yeah. Okay. And that's typical of schizophrenia. Yeah. Still thinking about it. So after we talk about schizophrenia, you'll have to tell me which one like your gut says, because I'll be curious too. But yeah, and sometimes people don't fit neatly into one, which makes it even more maddening to try and like wrap your head around, right? But it sounds more like schizophrenia than, just from that, like the paranoia and stuff is very common of schizophrenia.
Schizophrenia, like I said, the thing was it never really interfered.
Okay.
But the paranoia was of the like I feel
Yeah. Interesting. And okay, and to make it really complicated, and this is exceedingly rare, but it could happen. You could in theory have dissociative identity disorder and one of your subpersonalities has schizophrenia. It would be uncommon, but it's
I'm
possible.
gonna be thinking about this. for
Yeah,
this.
yeah, and that's totally fine, right? But I mean, that's in theory possible as well. It's very uncommon, but it could happen. Yeah. So, yeah, I'll be curious what you think after we cover that. Yeah, I mean, if you wanted to, like, if that's what you're interested in, I don't want to say no. So, yeah, you could if you wanted. If you have enough, like, information, you're,
Unfortunately,
yeah, I do. That would be fine with me. If that's what interests you, I want you to run with it. So think about it, think about it. Yeah, you too. How's it going?
Pretty good, how are you?
Good, good, good. What's up?
I just had a question.
Yeah.
I recently got a job actually as an ABA therapist.
Oh, fun. Okay, congratulations.
The training I know is in person.
Okay.
It's during the school days.
Okay.
So I was wondering, would it be all right, like, if I told you in advance what days I'd be missing?
Yeah, are you thinking you're gonna have to miss a lot of them or
I
just?
think it would just be like a Monday, Wednesday, and then maybe like a month. So like
Okay.
3 classes.
Yeah, so I mean, obviously we can, like, the lectures are recorded, so that
Yeah.
helps.
Yeah,
You could connect with somebody around you to get notes, that would help.
sounds good.
And then you could let me know and we could also exchange. So I think we can work around it.
Okay.
So that it doesn't cause you issues.
Mhm.
Yeah, and as long as you're willing to like watch the lecture and get caught up on your own, you'll be fine.
Sounds
Yeah,
good.
yeah, yeah.
Okay.
Especially, and then if we have an assignment or something, then we can try and work on that too.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna say.
Yeah, yes, that way you don't miss points.
Yeah, yeah.
That's the important thing, right?
Yeah, and
Yeah.
I could get like an excuse note if that's.
No, it's okay. I don't need that, but yeah, when you have the days, you could always let me know and we can, when
Yeah.
it gets closer.
I think I actually know them.
Oh,
Now,
okay.
'cause they told me that right after I got hired. And it's
Mm,
March 10th. And then that, so it'd be the 10th and the 12th and then the 17th.
Yeah, so like mood and suicidality. So yeah, I mean, yeah, so when we are like right in that time, when we get there, you could always email me that week and like, or that day that you miss and remind me, and then if there's an assignment. Like,
Sounds good.
yeah, I think
Thank
you'll
you.
be okay. Yeah,
Cool.
that's a cool job. That was one of my first psych jobs too.
Yeah.
It's a good one
It's
to
my
get
first
your
ever
foot.
job, like, in the field,
Yeah.
so it'd be fun.
That's a good one to get your foot in the door. I like it. Cool. Yeah, see you later. So the network was down today, so I
Okay.
wasn't able to print it.
Okay.
Normally, yes, but not today.
Got signed last week's for the abnormal.
Oh, okay, it's not worth points, it just helps me keep track. of
Okay,
things
all right, I just
here.
wanted to make sure.
Yeah, so you're okay.
Okay.
Lost points. Good.
Love that. That's my favorite thing for-
Actually, it started my girl. If I was listening to it, I was fine.
Oh, really? No. So you like watch it? Oh, so it's basically like the low budget. Oh, that's pretty cool.
I just did not have enough time to get on my back. Maybe like you say, it's like. That makes sense. No. Is it killing you? I don't know.
Yeah.
Shot. I don't. Yeah. Staring at the bat, it's like, it hurts. Oh, it's fair.
Fine.
I started seeing my paper drawing, and that was great. I was like. I just did that. Sometimes we can just avoid doing it. It looks nice. We're just
That's like a whole other. Somehow draws it. It's like perfect. It's like, well, it's like, okay. So, it's your, they never have to erase the.